guess maybe we should start, and we'll each kind of have a little segment of 10, 15 minutes or so to talk. Richard and Ed to talk about their collecting and to highlight some objects from their collections. But before that, I wanted to do a brief overview of some themes and some objects within our exhibition, particularly, pardon me, if there are any folks, who haven't been to see the exhibition, this will be a little bit of an overview. But I encourage folks who haven't to come and see this exhibition in person if possible. It's been very exciting, and we're honored to have these pieces on view. Great. So I guess without further ado, I will try to share my screen and do a little bit of an overview PowerPoint here. Oops. From the beginning. Great. So here we have a view of our kind of introductory wall at the top of the stairs with several, just really beautiful pieces. And you can see here, this is an extraordinary portrait of a Hong merchant at left, a young unidentified Hong merchant. And then at right, this is a rank badge, a textile piece, silk from our collection, that is very similar to the badge that is worn by the individual in the Hong merchant in this painting. And I think it's just a sort of beautiful piece. These this peacock rank badge is one that would have been used to sort of identify the position and the rank held by the wearer, who would have the same rank badge on the front and the back of his jacket, as this individual does here. And these were folks who were responsible for interacting with Western merchants, for engaging in trade, which was highly regulated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries during an era sort of when the Chinese were trading with Westerners, but there was a lot of concern and worry about fear of attack, that led them to have a very restricted sort of method and process for engaging in trade with Americans, with British, with others. Here's a view of sort of this entrance, the first segment of the exhibition. And, just to give a little bit of a kind of overview, to think about, since the colonial era, Americans have treasured Chinese export goods. Silk, tea, porcelain, and other highly valued commodities were controlled by the British and subject to heavy taxation until the end of the American Revolution. In February 1784, 5 months after the war's end, the Empress of China, the first American vessel to trade directly with China, launched from New York Harbor with a hold full of ginseng, cloth, furs, and other items to trade for Chinese goods. America was ready to take its place on the world stage. This exhibition considers the early trade relationship between the United States and China, with examples of fine and decorative arts created mostly by Chinese artists and artisans for the American export market. With more than 100 artworks and historical artifacts, this exhibition explores the cultural and economic exchange between China and the United States in the 18th and 19th century that helped to shape a young nation and establish the roots of a complex geopolitical relationship that endures today. With a focus on Connecticut objects and stories, this exhibition showcases regional merchants, sailors, and patrons who participated in early trans-Pacific trade. Connecticut's involvement in the China trade was smaller in scale than that of New York, Boston, Salem, and Newport, but ports in New Haven, Stonington, New London, and sites along the Connecticut River helped shape American identity, industry, and global presence. And you can see this is just sort of to think about this frame of reference, the event of the Boston Tea Party, and how these crates of Chinese tea are thrown in the Boston Harbor in 1773 in protest of taxation on tea, and overall, any of this trade with China before the end of the American Revolution, all of these objects are coming into America through the British East India Company. So, all the sort of profits are going to them, and Americans were very keen to deal directly with China, to be able to buy and sell and select objects from around the world that they could trade on their own. So this was a powerful lure to be able to engage in direct trade with China. We have several objects in the exhibition that represent this inaugural voyage on the Empress of China, including this magnificent punch bowl that was brought back by captain of this voyage, John Green, in 1784, with a view of the um, Hong buildings. So these were the spaces in which trade was conducted in Canton, Guangzhou. And these were the only spaces that were very limited where trade could be undertaken. And then on the inside of this punch bowl is an image of, I think, what's meant to be the Empress of China itself, although it is probably sort of a stock image of a ship from this era or earlier. This is a case with that beautiful punch bowl that gives a sense of scale. And at right, up on the little riser, is another smaller punch bowl that reflects a Connecticut story. This is a punch bowl that was brought back by John Morgan of Groton, Connecticut, who was the ship's carpenter. And he sadly fell ill and died on the return voyage. But some of his goods, the things he had acquired on this trip, were passed on to his family, who eventually gave them to Mr. Seaport. Um, Several other key pieces that came out of this inaugural voyage were this magnificent commission for a dinner service with the emblem of the Society of the Cincinnati that was commissioned for George and Martha Washington of Virginia. And this is a very rare and highly esteemed set of Chinese export porcelain. So we're lucky to have these pieces on view here. In this case are several other pieces that relate to the Washingtons and to the Society of the Cincinnati that reflect the efforts of Samuel Shaw, the supercargo, on this first voyage. And something that I think, almost can't be expressed enough is how talented Chinese artists and artisans were at taking ideas, imagery that were often sort of provided through prints or drawings or other examples, and producing just extraordinarily beautiful porcelain that is decorated with very patriotic images of the eagle for the American market. And this is happening, right at the end of the American Revolution and the beginning of the early Republic, in this moment when Americans are just so eager for beautiful objects that express and try to kind of solidify what it means to be American in this early moment. I think it's very powerful. And we can see here, not just porcelain, but Chinese are producing other decorative arts objects, including this beautiful wooden relief from the Tiedemann collection that is later in date, but I think is extraordinary, showing the flags, the eagle, but then with this very Chinese sort of traditional imagery around the frame. Um, some things that we highlight within the exhibition are some trade goods that were particularly beloved. Tea, for one. This case focuses on sort of some of the logistics of the tea service, and the beautiful example at the right has decoration with tea being collected and processed, and then a tea bowl and saucer in which you would be drinking your Chinese tea and sort of thinking about where it's produced and how. Um, there were a number of paintings that depicted the stages, the location, sort of the steps in cultivating tea, that were very interesting to Western audiences. So here we have, this is one of two from probably a larger set of 12, um, that show tea being crated, sort of packed up to be sent abroad. Then another painting from the Dietrich Foundation shows in the foreground some tea crates being loaded onto a vessel in Canton Harbor, Guangzhou. So thinking about the trips, that the tea takes to get to the West. The production of porcelain is also a theme that really fascinated Westerners. And there were other additional sort of series of multiple steps within the production of porcelain, which was this mysterious and very complex process of production that the West, couldn't replicate for quite some time. So here we have two steps sort of in that process. We have an interesting case with some examples of sort of steps in decoration of porcelain, which would often sometimes, only segments would be added at the very end to a kind of pre-existing pattern or cartouche, where you might put your initials, kind of in a central segment. And at the very left from Historic Stonington, we have this great bundle of porcelain with its original raffia wrapping, from when it was created and shipped overseas in the 19th century, which is pretty extraordinary. Other trade goods included lacquerware and silk. Then there is a little section that focuses on Connecticut and how this China trade sort of intersects with some other trade, such as whaling, the West Indies trade. Here is a ship that shifts from first being participating in the China trade, then in the gold rush, the tannery trade, and then as a whaling ship. I love this little case where we have some of the goods that were produced or collected by American merchants and then traded to the Chinese. Seal fur, sandalwood, ginseng, North American ginseng, and silver were goods that the Chinese sought and would trade with the Americans. But these were difficult to and not environmentally sustainable. So after not much time, sandalwood, was over um, chopped down, and the fur seals were overhunted, leaving the Americans without many viable goods. So there was a trade imbalance really from the very beginning between the Americans and the Chinese, that there was so much that we wanted from the Chinese and not much that they wanted, that we could supply for them. Several key voyages sailed out of Connecticut, this one being the voyage of the Neptune, sailing out of New Haven in 1796. And we have a great little miniature portrait on loan from the New Haven Museum of the captain of that ship, um, Daniel Green, and a reproduction of the order for tea that was put in by the folks on that ship, the Townsend family, and as well as a cider jug that they had acquired, the Townsends, on that voyage. And that particular voyage was particularly profitable, and it involved hunting for fur seals off the southern tip of South America and then trading those furs to the Chinese. So it was extraordinarily profitable, but was um, a kind of formula that was repeated, but never as successfully, in part because the fur seal population dropped pretty dramatically. Samuel Russell is another Connecticut individual who has a huge impact in the trade with China. From uh, Middletown, Connecticut, he establishes his firm, Russell and Company, in 1824, which grows to become the largest and most influential American firm in the 19th century. And I think Richard will talk a little bit more about him. Um, this is just another beautiful painting by the extraordinary painter, Chinese painter Lam Qua, of these buildings, the different nations' factories where trade would take place along the Pearl River waterfront in Canton, Guangzhou. I know I'm going over the time that I'm supposed to, and I will try to sort of make this very quick, but we have some portraits of other Hong merchants who were the intermediaries with Western merchants and were responsible for sort of all the trade and business that occurred with Westerners. And Hao Qua is perhaps the most famous of these merchants and was known as the richest man in the world for a portion of the 19th century. There are two beautiful paintings from Ed Tiedemann's collection of Hauqua's gardens, which were beautiful spaces where Hauqua would bring a number of his Western merchant associates to sort of see the splendors of Chinese gardens, architecture, and these were highly influential to garden architecture and architecture in general, landscape in the West. Um, just sort of breeze through. Hopefully, folks will come to see the show. But we have some other remarkable paintings that focus a bit on, kind of how Westerners lived when they were doing business in China, and women and children were allowed to reside in Macau, which had been under Portuguese control, a tiny spot at the base, sort of across before one enters the Pearl River. So this is a remarkable house owned by or rented by Nathaniel Kinsman and his wife Rebecca. And we have some other individual stories as well that sort of look at some positive contributions that Westerners made in terms of some hospitals, doctors, and scholars. George Rogers Hall establishes a hospital in Shanghai, and is also a remarkable botanist, very interested in Chinese and Japanese plants. Then in the last room of the exhibition, we explore some of the troubling history of the Opium Wars and how, with the waning of other materials to trade, The British, and to a lesser extent, the American merchants, focused more and more on exporting opium, despite the objections of the Chinese government and officials. And this eventually led to the outbreak of two wars that of course, were not fairly fought because of the strength of the British Navy. Um, and these resulted in the opening up of additional ports to trade with the West and Western nations taking advantage of the Chinese in pretty reprehensible ways. And there are some individual pieces that sort of reflect on details of this history. This beautiful portrait of Imperial High Commissioner Qiang, who was in the difficult position of having to negotiate these treaties with the West that are known as the unequal treaties, including the 1842, um, uh, this sort of treaties that ended the First Opium War. And then there are several other paintings that focus on episodes within the First and the Second Opium Wars. Um, then we have a little segment that looks at the clipper ship era. And some Connecticut stories sort of play a strong role there, certainly. In Stonington, Captain Nathaniel Palmer contributed to the design of some of these clipper ships, including at right, this is a model of the Hauqua, ship built in 1844 based on new designs recommended by Palmer. And he was captain of several voyages of the Hauqua and brought his wife and his niece along on several of these voyages. And there are some fascinating papers, documents at Historic Stonington, where his niece, Sarah Elizabeth Fanning, records her experiences at sea. Then, at left, this is a painted portrait of the Challenge, a clipper ship that was owned by the NL&G Griswold Company that was established by merchant brothers Nathaniel Lind Griswold and his brother George Griswold of Lyme, Connecticut. Then the very last little segment that focuses on a Connecticut story is one based in Hartford and in New Haven of educational exchange. And here, this individual, Young Wing, was the first Chinese student to graduate from an American university. And he attended Yale and graduated in 1854, after which point he becomes involved in an American missionary program in Hartford, the Chinese Educational Mission, a program that brought 120 Chinese boys to study in New England between 1872 and 1881. And we have a couple of pieces on loan from the Connecticut Museum of Cultural and History that represent, things that relate to these exchange students. Thank you. Sorry, that was overly long. But now to turn to Ed Tiedemann to talk about some of his collecting and a recent acquisition of his. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me here in Concord, Massachusetts. By the way, I should note that I do not have a PhD in art history itself, but a PhD in electrical engineering. So I come to this as a collector and as a hobby versus someone who's professionally in this particular field. Next, please, Tanya. Yeah, I wanted to show one of my newest acquisitions on the left here, which unfortunately we did not have in time to get into the exhibition, but is John Smith Crary, who is from Stonington, Connecticut. And this is a very interesting painting. And it's one of the few where it was believed done from one of the Hong factories. Now, I'll explain the Hong factories in a minute, but Bridgman was in Canton, which was now Guangzhou, China, on the Pearl River from basically about 1809 to 1810. I haven't been able to do a lot of research. Some of the great reference books and things like that exist, really don't talk about him. But he and his family was primarily focused on importing silks from China and focused on that market. On the right side, you see a painting of the Hongs, okay, or the Hong factories to be more specific on this. These were a row of buildings on the Pearl River, which Tanya mentioned previously, where basically the ship captains, the supercargoes, and the trading representatives and consuls could stay during the trading season, which was a part of the year when they were allowed to be in Canton. The rest of the year, they had to go down to Macau. Those other people on the ship, all the sailors and all that, actually had to stay down in Whampoa, where I think we may have a photo of, certainly there was a painting in the exhibition showing Whampoa. Now, this painting was done about 1805. It's very interesting that it's a very small whale on brass. And you can see here the various flags of the countries which were present in 1805. You have the Danish, the Spanish, the American, the Swedish, the British, or I should say that of the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. By the time that John Smith Carey was there, the Danish were no longer there. They came back in a later era. I'd like to just go on now to the next slide, which is one of the great paintings of Canton, done about 1855. You can see quite a bit's changed. The style of this painting is very, very refined. But there you also see a large number of the factories there. You see a church now that's basically in the very front of many of the factories here. And then you see the flags of the US, France, the United Kingdom, and Denmark. But also around this time, there were representatives or consuls from a number of other countries, including Brazil, Chile, Peru, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Prussia, and Saxony. So it's very interesting how much was there at that particular time. If we move on to the next painting, and this is what, if you actually read the booklet, China from China, you'll get a description that I wrote about how I actually got involved in collecting China trade paintings. I won't go into that, but this is a dragon boat. A dragon boat is a type of boat that actually originated in this Pearl River Delta area. So the Pearl River flows from its mouth up near Canton to Canton and actually past Canton, but past Canton. Two important cities are on the mouth. Okay. I like to think of it to the north and to the south. To the north, we have Hong Kong. To the south, we have Macau. Actually, if you look at it, the river sort of flows to the north and it's to the east and to the west. But we think of China sort of from the south to the north of China. So this is an incredible thing. They have dragon boat races. Dragon boats have existed for around 2,000 years, I think, in South China. This one shows over 50 rowers, two people beating the big drum and two people beating the big gong there. So why don't we move on to the next potential slide? And this is what is called one of the folly forts in the river. Specifically, this is the Dutch folly fort. So this is a fortress originally built by the Chinese. It was sitting effectively in the river. This is a wonderful, super highly detailed painting. At the very left, you can see the hongs, the end of the hongs there. And this particular painting descended through the Forbes family okay, and the Forbes we'll get into a little bit later, were traders that worked for Russell and Company, okay, in Canton and back in the US, United States. So, by the way, if you get to Milton, Massachusetts, they have the Forbes House, Robert Bennett Forbes House, which has many of these paintings, and it's worthwhile to understand and see that. Okay, why don't we go on to the next slide? They're in the exhibition. There are two paintings by Hoqua. This is an interesting one, and this was done by an artist called Ting Kwa or his studio. So this is a gouache on paper showing Hoqua, the trader, or I should say the Hong merchant, in a Trump Doyle type of an arrangement. So there's a frame around a frame, effectively in this, which makes it sort of interesting. Now, Hoqua, okay, was the most important of the Hong merchants during much of the era. In fact, he basically was living until about 1843, died just after the First Opium War. And he became very powerful. He actually was supplying a lot of tea. He owns a lot of tea plantations in China. He sold a lot of tea to the British, and he actually liked the Americans. And this is really important from the perspective of this because the British were very big and powerful, and they sent all these huge East India Company ships to China every year. And he sort of said, well, let me deal with these upstart Americans. Okay. And he used them, tried to use them a bit as a foil for the British to sort of, have a little bit better balance there. But he was one of the first to really take into account these Americans. And the Americans were a little bit early on, didn't have necessarily the money. And so he actually helped to set up a credit system. And so just one of the fascinating things about this early trade is the entire banking system and the systems that sort of emerged from that. Okay, well, let me just tell you that if I go on to the next one, please, we have a letter that was written by John Perkins Cushing on behalf of Hoqua. It was signed by Hoqua, both in Chinese and, of course, in English. Hoqua could write his name that much in English, but he really spoke rough English. But John Perkins Cushing spent almost 25 years in China, okay, and he became a confidant to some extent of Hoqua and penned much of his correspondence for him to Americas and the West. Okay, just to bring this thing, John Perkins Cushing was helpful in actually setting up Russell and Company in China. And his company, which was the Perkins and Company, formed into Russell and Company. So Russell and Company was this big one we were talking about earlier. So continuing on this line, what we have here is John Perkins Cushing writing this letter. And this letter is done in 1814 during the War of 1812, as we call, and actually says to his people that he was dealing with in Baltimore to please send the funds from the shipment, okay, up to the Perkins family, essentially in Boston, because they're going to take care of your funds, okay. And he didn't want to send the funds back by ship to China because he was worried about the British capturing the ship and therefore losing his funds. So what happened was the Perkins family, and then later it was turned over to the Forbes family, were actually investing funds in the United States for Hoqua, and the returns on that investment flowed back to the Hoqua family for much of the 19th century. So after John Perkins Cushing returned, then they decided to send out to China, okay, Thomas Tunno Forbes. He unfortunately died off the coast of China in a storm. And then they sent out John Murray Forbes, and then after John Murray Forbes, Robert Bennett Forbes. Okay. All of these were with Russell and Company, and all were people who made a tremendous amount of money in the China trade. So let me continue with the next one. I'm going to now move up the coast, okay, to Shanghai. So with the first Opium War, a number of ports were opened up in China, more than just Canton. One of the ports was Shanghai. Shanghai at the time of the first Opium War was not a huge city. It was a relatively small city for China things. But because of its location relative to the great Yangtze River, opening up the center part of China, it quickly became a major port. This is a painting of Hiram Fogg ship chandlers. The Fogg family was from Maine, had a tremendous influence in trading. And what's important for maybe some of you people who are art fans is this is where the money came that's founded the Fogg Art Museums at Harvard University. I want to move on to the next slide, which points out what's called the French settlement in Shanghai. And behind me, if you look at the screen, you actually see what is now called the International Settlement of Shanghai. And were originally the British, but the British and Americans merged and then became the International Settlement. But what I want to do is point out a couple of things from this wonderful painting of the French portion. If you go to the next one, Tanya, on the very right side, okay, you see actually the Hiram Fogg ship chandlers, what we just saw in the previous photo. Continuing down, you actually see the French consulate. And for the third one, I want to bring out, you actually see a dock of the Shanghai Steam Navigation Company, which was the steamship company that went up and down the Yangtze River and some of the ports of China. And that was essentially of the Russell family. And actually okay, there. And just behind this is actually the old city of Shanghai. So if you've ever been in Shanghai, if you've been in the old city, this is just on the river. Of course, this whole waterfront has changed significantly since this era when this painting was particularly done in basically the 1860s, early 1860s. So why don't we move on to the next one? And I wanted to just end with two paintings of ships. This is one of the ships that you sort of like you saw in the previous painting, which is actually in the exhibition. And this is from the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, a ship. And this ship plied between Shanghai, Nagasaki, Kobe, Japan. By the way, Nagasaki's in Japan, and Yokohama, Japan. This painting was actually interestingly done by a painter who was in Nagasaki, okay, Japan. Let's turn to the next slide. And this is of a ship, the Szechuan. This was a ship that was owned by the Shanghai Steam Navigation Company, i.e. the Russell Company. Okay, and this one was basically done this painting was done about 1863. It's an early screw-powered steamship in China. It was designed to go up the Yangtze River. But the Yangtze River is a tricky river. And so this was not a very successful ship because it kept running aground and having problems with its propeller hitting sandbars and things like that. So it only existed around for a number of years. But it's just interesting in bringing this connection in. By the way, this is one of the few paintings where we actually know who the artist was, okay, and where he actually was located in Shanghai. So thank you all, and let me turn it back to, actually it goes over to Richard right now.
Thank you, Ed. This is fantastic.
Great. Tanya and Ed, thank you so much. Amazing segments in this presentation. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Richard Dietrich, and the Dietrich American Foundation is a collection of early American art and artifacts, and it was assembled by my father, H. Richard Dietrich Jr. And I just want to really quickly say, if anybody on this Zoom has not been to the exhibit yet, you've got about 3, 4 weeks to go. September 14th is the closing date. And I hope that you get a chance to see it. If you only saw it once, go see it again. And there's a wonderful small free catalog called China from China. And I've got a image of it there. And it's really, really nicely done. So Tanya Pohrt is the curator. She did an amazing job. And Jane LeGros is also did an amazing job. Eileen Donovan, Sam Quigley, the whole Lyman Allyn team. And again, really, really try to go and see it. And then with Ed Tiedemann, I've said this before, but I think that if you were to go into that show and kind of look at it and then close your eyes and open them and all the things that Ed put on loan were to somehow magically disappear, it would be a totally different show. So Ed really put some incredible paintings into the show, which make it so much better. So next slide, please. These are a cup and saucer from Captain Green, who is the first captain to go to China with the Empress of China that left New York Harbor in 1784. And these are in the collection. So next slide. And these two pieces, people might recognize this, and Tanya did show these. These are George and Martha Washington's dinner service, and the emblem is the Society of the Cincinnati. And these were in early order. I think the order was placed when the Empress of China went. I think George and Martha got these in either 1885 or 1886. So the Empress went over from New York Harbor in February, and it came back May of 1785. And so, a year and 3 months later. And the ship had about a 25% return, which wasn't amazing, but it was good enough to show that this kind of thing can be very successful. And it was then off to the races after that, where many, many more ships started being planned. And this was, it was a private venture. It wasn't a venture of the United States government. It wasn't something like the British East India Company that Tanya mentioned, which was a company, but really an extension of the British government. And so next slide, please, Tanya. And so I think the Chinese saw in the Americans people who were kind of similar to themselves in a way, people who were enterprising and trying to make money and trying to make connections and kind of make their way in the world. And as I think either Ed or Tanya said, that Haokwa kind of saw in the Americans almost like a counterbalance to the British East India Company. So this piece is something that is in the Dietrich American Foundation collection. It's hard to read that, and it says view of Wesleyan University, Middletown, right? I think that's what it says. View of, can't quite read that, but anyway, it's Wesleyan University, Middletown. And this is by a scrimshander, a sailor on a sailing ship. We don't know who the sailor was. We don't know what ship this sailor was on, but we do, and it is a he because everybody was a he on those ships. But this artist became known as the Connecticut Cityscape Engraver. And so this person would engrave scenes of Wesleyan or Middletown or Hartford, New Britain, various Connecticut scenes. And my father went to Wesleyan. This was an early acquisition. Next slide, please. And so just a little bit about the foundation collection. This is a letter that's in the collection, and it's by George Washington. And what's really special about it is that it's written, you can see Falls of Delaware, S side, 10 December 1776. So the letter is a few pages. It's to Lund, Washington, who is his nephew, who is taking care of Mount Vernon. It continues, the letter, he puts it down. It continues on December 17th, and it has all sorts of, sort of messages about the plight of the Continental Army and trembling for Philadelphia because it's being occupied by General Howe. But then he also has instructions about how Lund should plant trees in the spring in Mount Vernon, and trading a horse for a horse of at least equal value. So Washington was a real micromanager. But it's extraordinary that he's doing all this in a tent. And then, of course, a week later, after December 17th, on Christmas Day, he crosses the Delaware. And, the whole sort of, momentum of the war starts to shift. So next slide, please. And then this is a copy in the foundation of the Federalist Papers. And this is, of course, Alexander Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. And it's a bound compilation of essays defending the new Constitution, trying to say this is why we need this. The country needs this. And this, in fact, is interesting because it was collected by a guy named Henry Flint, and Henry Flint and his wife started Historic Deerfield, and they really wanted to actually expand Historic Deerfield. And so they sold a number of pieces in what was called the Heritage Foundation collection. And this was one of them. And it helped start Historic Deerfield. So next slide. And then some of the other things that my father collected early on, he started collecting at a really early age. He had the means to do it. He was fortunate for that. And then his first area was really books and manuscripts, until he found, a love for furniture and decorative arts. And in fact, the George and Martha Washington platter were his first sort of foray into three-dimensional objects instead of books and manuscripts. But this is a first printing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And there were a lot of these were printed at the time. There was a music store owner named Carr, and his music store, you can see on there, is 36 Baltimore Street in Baltimore. But he's the one who really convinced Francis Scott Key to turn it into a song, the poem into a song. And it was an old British drinking song that was and still is the rhyme for the song. So these weren't rare at the time, but they're really rare now because so few survived. Next, please. And then some of the other things in the collection are furniture. This is a Lancaster, Pennsylvania highboy or high chest. And, it's what's amazing about this is it's from the 1770s, and you see a tiny little community like Lancaster at the time, Pennsylvania Germans, was very, very prosperous. And this is something you might see in Philadelphia, but it's actually being made way out in Lancaster, west of Philly. Next, please. And then this is another Pennsylvania German related piece. This is later. This is 1830s. And it's from a place called the Mohantongo Valley, and that's an Indian name. And it's actually loosely translates to place where the meat is plentiful. But it was a place where a number of Pennsylvania Germans, as they kind of ran out of land west of Philly, they kept moving west and moving west and moving west. And this was out kind of toward the Alleghenies, in Pennsylvania. Next. And then this might be the most important piece of furniture, maybe the most important object in the Dietrich American Foundation. And this is by Daniel Goddard. And it's a Newport, what they call a knee-hole dressing table or dressing bureau. And what's kind of interesting about the knee hole is you could pull up a chair and kind of, wedge your knees in there. It doesn't look terribly comfortable, but it has the shell carvings that show Newport. And then this one, kind of in terms of, kind of attributes, has a lot of different little things going on the feet and on the kind of the skirt of each of these, pillars. And then it has this interesting fretwork by the shells, so sort of like a basket weave pattern. And what's also interesting about it is that if you pull out one of the drawers, the middle drawer, it says Daniel Goddard, his drawer. And so he, signed it in chalk, which is very rare. And, again, this may be our greatest piece. And I kind of like to argue it may be the greatest piece of American furniture. And if you go to the next slide, here it is in a show at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And you can see that it's really not that big and it would be easy to walk by. And it's now in galleries at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, not in this special exhibit. And a lot of people do just walk by it. But, it's one of these great kind of compact architectural forms and a great American, truly American form. Next slide. And then this is another great piece in the collection. I know we're, kind of off the China trade topic, but I'm trying to give you a window into, in this case, the collector. And this is a Paul Revere teapot and silver. And it's, something that he was a very, very successful silversmith. And then his real claim to fame now is, of course, the ride and one if by land, two if by sea, and the bells from the Old North Church. But if you go to the next slide, what's wonderful is this John Singleton Copley portrait of Revere. Revere chose how he'd be painted, and Revere at that time was a very wealthy man because he was, incredible entrepreneur, silversmith, but he had an entire forge where he was making other metal work. They did the copper on the USS Constitution. He wasn't just doing silver, his shop was doing silver, but he wanted to be shown as an artisan in this portrait. And there he is. And we really believe that's the Dietrich American Foundation teapot. It looks exactly the same. And there's no other one that's known to exist. Who knows, maybe one will come out of an attic somewhere, but it seems to be the same one. Next, please. And then this is a little portrait of George Washington by James Peale. And we chose this as the cover of a book that we did that was kind of on a previous slide, but it's called In Pursuit of History. And this little portrait miniature is really tiny, but it's an intimate look at George Washington. And so you can kind of see a theme here with my father as a collector. The things that he's picking are kind of founding era, United States history, things that were defining of that time, roughly 1740 to 1820. Some things like the Montongo are later. A number of the China trade items are later. Next slide, please. And then this is in the back of that gold locket is some of Washington's hair. And interestingly, it wasn't that hard to get a president's hair. You could kind of write a letter and a lot of people would oblige. I cannot imagine, Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Barack Obama doing the same, but these were different times. Next slide. So then back to the China trade objects, and this is an interesting couple pieces. This was from a service of probably 225 pieces, and these memorialize the death of George Washington. And so this is a pattern. It's a Pennsylvania family, a Philadelphia family, and this is the pattern that they chose. And at that time, there was no memorial to Washington. That would be at Mount Vernon. It would be later. But this kind of memorial with the weeping willow, showing mourning and the kind of imagined, memorial to Washington with an eagle on top. And interestingly, the pattern, though, is very similar to the Captain Green from much earlier. This is about 1800, 1801. The Captain Green porcelain was about 1785. Next, please. And then this is a fun pattern. It's called the Quaker Farmer, or sometimes Cow China. And this was a Quaker family named Morris in Philadelphia. And the Morrises were, prominent Philadelphians. And they wanted to show their kind of agrarian roots. And so this is what they chose. And it was actually a Dutch Delft pattern that was sent over. But what was sent back, is wonderful. And if we were able to get a real close-up of the farmer, he looks a little Asiatic, and the cow looks more water buffalo than Holstein cow or some other, Pennsylvania breed. And the trees and, vegetation certainly look Asian. And then Tanya, when Ed and I were, looking at this, they're clearly from a couple different services. So, maybe another family member got this service because some have this more fancy pattern and some have the sort of simple but beautiful, just gold band, gilt gold band. Next, please. And so this is just a depiction of, maybe what the Empress of China looked like. I found this online. But again, this is really what inspired my father about collecting China, because everything he collected was really things made in America. And they were, items from either colonial or federal period primarily. But in this case, these are items made in China and they're made for the American market. But what really excited him about the whole China trade story, and he first really got inspired by it by listening to Eleanor Gordon, who was a incredible antiques dealer and really a China trade and Chinese ceramics expert. And her and her husband, Horace Gordon, were great friends. And it was a lecture that Eleanor gave that, really turned my father onto this. But again, it was that maritime history. It was the history of the United States and the kind of wealth that was being generated and how important it was to the story of American history. So next slide, please. And this is just a depiction. So, it's interesting to look at just how far these places were. And this is, what the American China trade was trying to break into. This is what the English were doing. And they were leaving, and the other Europeans that Ed mentioned, were all doing this from different ports around Europe. And, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Danes, the Dutch, all these powers, the French. But the English, what they were doing is they were coming down and they were, stopping somewhere like the Canary Islands, then down to, their colony in South Africa, and then over to Indonesia and up. And that's what the Americans wanted to emulate, to really cut out that middleman and really make that kind of wealth for themselves instead of giving that wealth to the British. So next slide, please. And Ed mentioned the Whampoa anchorage, and this is a nice depiction of it. And basically, it's at the mouth of the Pearl River, where, not the mouth as it goes out to the sea, but as, you're kind of getting into the river and it's starting to get a little bit more narrow, and there are all these islands in this estuary. And this Whampoa Island was a great anchorage, safe anchorage. And as Ed mentioned, the captain and the supercargo, who's the person on the ship who really didn't have a lot to do during the voyage except worry about the cargo, once they got to the anchorage, these little boats would take them up the Pearl River about 10 or 12 miles to Canton, present-day Guangzhou, China. But the big ship and the, crew of 35 or 40 or even more, and the bigger clippers that, were built later, would just stay. And they'd be on these ships for 5 months. They'd have a little bit of shore leave, but not a lot. And, Ed, in our call earlier, as we were going over some of these, mentioned that this, body of water was actually clogged with little ships. The paintings seldom show that, but there would be, vendors coming out to the big ships, and ships of ill repute and everything else was, in that water trying to kind of make a buck off these foreign traders. And then that rock in the center, that hill, was actually the foreign cemetery. And so a story, is an interesting one, is how many people died because of diseases that were foreign to them and just the close quarters. Next slide, please. Another, view of Canton, which we've seen. Next, please. And then just, this is kind of fun, but this is the sort of, scale that we're dealing with today. And again, I think that's why this story is so relevant, because what we're talking about and what this great exhibit at the Lyman Allyn Museum shows is that origin story of what has now come. And, this complicated history of trade with China and being friends, maybe enemies with China, frenemies kind of thing. And but the scale of the trade is just massive. And so this is the Ever Given. And on there are, containers that are either 10 feet at the end, 10 by 10, and then either 20 or 40 feet long are the standard sizes. And if you were to stack this thing full of 10 by 20s, there'd be about, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 15,000 or so of these stacked containers. So next slide, please. Of course, there it is, wedged in the Suez Canal. This is the unfortunate one that, got taken by the wind. But next. And then here it is with the Empress of China, which was 108 feet long and had a crew of about 38. And if you put it up to the hull of the ship, it would actually be a lot smaller. But what they were transporting, of course, they didn't have containers then, but what they were transporting could probably only fit in about 2 containers. And they were packing all that in. And what they brought over, as Tanya mentioned, was things like seal and otter fur and, ginseng dug by American Indians in American forests, and sandalwood from Hawaii, and maybe mahogany could be brought over, lead, cordage. The Americans actually had things that the Chinese wanted. The British did not. And the British really only had silver. And so that's why the British turned to opium. And they had colonies in India, obviously, and there was a plentiful supply of opium. Americans later would start dealing in opium, and it became a huge, a bigger and bigger problem. But in those early days, it was less. But Americans were more dealing in Turkish opium. And Samuel Russell, again, next slide, please.
Oops. Hold on. Sorry.
No problem. And so again, this is like the American China had these patriotic images. Part of the reason for that was that the British would have coats of arms for their families, and the Americans didn't have any of that, sort of to do. And so they wanted to put something, and they might put their initials, or they might choose a patriotic symbol like this. Next, please. This is an interesting piece, and it was in one of the images that Tanya showed, but it's a cider jug. And, I think that it shows a couple things. First of all, that pattern looks awfully similar to the Washington sort of remembrance pattern, and that, those custard cups that we saw. But then, of course, this has a kind of a Masonic amalgamation. And so whoever had this was a Mason and was proud of that. But what's funny about it is that what they had done is they sent a newspaper clipping of this, wonderful kind of assemblage of Masonic symbols. And there was an index with that they didn't send. And so each symbol was numbered, and then there were corresponding numbers in the index. And what's funny about this is that the Chinese put all the numbers in there. And, why wouldn't they? They didn't know not to. So all these things have, numbers, but there's no rhyme or reason to why they'd have numbers unless you know that it was a newspaper clipping. Next, please. And then this one is kind of fun. This was a cup and saucer that was actually created so that these merchants and the people who worked for them could show families, these are the kind of borders that you could get in a whole, dinner service of 225, plates and tureens and serving dishes and all the rest that came with it, bowls and, soup dishes. But some people actually liked it so much that they did their entire thing in this. And so there are a couple dinner services out there that have everything in this, sort of mishmash of patterns. Next, please. And then this is another image of, the process. And so there would be like, 15 images of the ceramic making process. And that was, again, used to show clients. But then also some collectors really enjoyed that and thought this is really exotic and neat. And they put these in their homes. Next, please. And so again, here's Samuel Russell. Russell's a fascinating figure. And what's really special about this show is actually we were able to track down a descendant of the Russells through the Middlesex County Historical Society, which is in Middletown, Connecticut. That's where the Russell family has always had their roots. And there's a wonderful gentleman named Sam Russell in New Jersey. And I first was able to get in touch with his sons and then with Sam and his wife. And they came to the show and with some cousins and, it was just really, really nice. And they put some things into the show. And, it was wonderful to kind of make that connection. But what's fascinating about Samuel Russell is that he was orphaned at 12 and he worked as an apprentice in a trade firm. And they were really more kind of coastal traders in Middletown. And Alsop was one of the names. And there is in Middletown an Alsop house, very prosperous family. Next slide, please. And so what he did is he was sent over to China by a Rhode Island sort of investment concern. And it was, an investment that was made, and he was sent over as that supercargo, that person in charge of assembling things and then trading those things, selling them, buying things when he's there. And he went over in 1819. And so the China trade, it started in 1784, but between 1785, when the Empress of China came back, and the War of 1812, about 400 voyages happened in those years. And then it just, the War of 1812 kind of stalled things out a little bit. And then after that, it was off to the races and bigger ships and even more. But this was a tea crate, and it's a wonderful thing that's in the show. It's part of the Middlesex County Historical Society. And, it just shouldn't have survived. It's a cheap wood tea crate with paper labels, paper lining. And it's just great that it's in there. And you can see the Chinese characters and extra fine young high sun tea. Next, please. And then this is interesting. So Samuel Russell, this is his house. And so again, he went over in 1819. He comes back, and in 1824, he had enough money and other investors in mind that he founded Russell and Company. And he was about 35 years old. He went over, and then by 1827, so 1824 to 1827, he's made enough money to build this house in Middletown. And this is this incredible Greek Revival house. The family gave this to Wesleyan in the early 1920s, early 20th century. And so it's still part of Wesleyan University. And it's up the Connecticut River. You can see a little map there, Middletown being right in the middle of Connecticut. And it's, next slide, please. It's just improbable that, a town like Middletown would be a center of the China trade. But it just shows that, it didn't really matter as long as there was good access to the sea. That was only a tiny part of the journey. And Middletown was a very prosperous place back then. But the big journey is getting out into the Sound. And then once you're out, you're into the open ocean. So the big journey, in other words, is the open ocean and over to Africa and then on around Africa into China. Again, this was shown before. This guy is in the kind of entryways. We go up the stairs to the exhibit. And we've always thought this is by Lumqua. Dr. Tiedemann has some questions about the attribution. It might might be earlier, might not be Lamqua. I'm all ears. I think, Ed really may well be right. But it's a wonderful depiction. We don't know who this is. And what's neat about this, again, Chinese artist, but it was made for an American home. So it was brought home and displayed in the home of either a supercargo or a ship's captain or the owner of a China trade firm. And it speaks to this people to people relationship, and especially the happier, sort of relationship of the earlier years of the China trade. Next slide, please. And then this is Hao Qua, the head of the Hong merchants. Next, please. This wonderful Hong bowl is in the foundation collection, but we've already heard about this. Next. And then this is the catalog. So that is, again, I really hope that people can go. You can get a free catalog at the show, and we'd love to, I know we've gone a little long, but we'd love to open it up to questions. And it's so great that so many people are on here. I think, we did say to put them in the chat, but I don't know, maybe we just open it up and people can shout out if they have questions, since I don't see any in the chat.
I think there have been some, although
Okay.
Ed's been
All right.
studiously answering some of the questions, which is great.
Oh, good. Oh, gosh, I see Moran O'Callahan there. Hey, Moran. Great. Yeah. So questions, I guess, can go in the, so should they go in the chat, Tanya?
I mean, I think if folks have a question now, they could just unmute
Perfect.
and ask it if they're able to do that. Or Eileen, I don't know, Cosgrove, if you had sort of identified a few questions from the chat, we could start with that.
And your point is correct. Dr. Tiedemann has been studiously answering these, so thank you very much. But I think there might have been one open point from Susan Anderson. She was talking about custom orders, and Ed answered, excuse me, Dr. Tiedemann answered, but he made mention of maybe if Mr. Sargent is still on and might have an observation or two. That's that comment is at 6:58 p.m. under Ed Tiedemann.
Okay.
Or if Ed wants to weigh in about what might be still open from the observation from Susan Anderson.
Chat, sorry.
Yeah, I don't have anything more. I made the comment that it took a long time to send an order up to Jinjinzhen for them to make it and get it back. So sometimes these happen on a second voyage or something like that. They were ordered and then came back on another ship. If I remember correctly, there's some debate on what came back on, the first Empress of China, but I'm no expert on that, on the porcelain aspect. So
there is a funny story about custom orders, and there was a British family that sent over, and they, like these others, like the Morrises, and they sent over an image that they wanted put on, and it was their coat of arms, and the colors came back wrong. And so then the second time, and so, like it goes over, months go by, a year and a half later, they get their China and it's wrong. And so then to really get it right, they sent an image and they wrote in, yellow and a kind of an arrow to what should be painted yellow, red. And then the entire 225 pieces came back with yellow, red. And the Peabody Essex Museum does have at least one of those, which are so great, in their collection.
So not the color, but the writing, you're saying.
Well, the color's in there, but the writing is also in there on the second go around. I mean, the family must have been so upset.
Yeah, by the way, we should note that it often took about 6 months to travel from the eastern part of the US to China at that time.
It's incredible.
It was a grueling voyage, either going around the Horn of Africa or Cape Horn. And different perspectives on which was the better route. Sometimes it went one way, going and another way coming back based upon their expectations of the winds. And there were pirates out there that could get you, particularly going around Cape of Good Hope down in the Indonesian islands and things like that, and around what we now call Singapore, Malaysia, things like that, and Sumatra. So,
Yeah, amazing.
I just wanted to add that lovely sort of smaller punch bowl that came from John Morgan, the ship's carpenter on the Empress of China. That has the Swedish flag is on that ship, so you get the sense that this was sort of what was available, or maybe kind of on the discount shelf, or the sort of
yeah.
existing something that was left over from another order that he probably was able to acquire for less money than that beautiful sort of large hong bowl that the captain had acquired.
Yeah, that's a great point. Any questions, people?
Yeah, by the way, while we're talking about hong bowls, an interesting point is maybe you saw in the exhibition the other hong bowl in Brazil. And one of the debates that we've been trying to think with somebody who's an expert of if they all came back on the same ship, and many of them have, a number of them have, in fact, 3 of them have in the center of it, a British ship Pitt in it.
Mm.
Who did they go to? Captain, maybe a couple of the investors,
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah, it's a great point. The big one that we do have did descend in the family of Captain Green, the captain of the Empress of China. We thought it came back when the ship came back, but I think it, the order was placed and it came back on another ship. And the only reason that we know that is because we thought it was a couple of years earlier, but there's around the side of the bowl shows the Canton waterfront, and there's a little picket fence, and that apparently was not there in 1785. It was there in 1786. Some expert figured that out, and so it's interesting to be able to date it by what the artist is drawing on the side of the ball.
Yeah. So yeah, on that, by the way, if you're interested in all those details, there's a great book that was done by Maria Mock, who is the curator of the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and Paul Van Dyke, who is a serious researcher. He's an American who's actually lived in Canton and now Macau for quite a few years, researching the original documents in Sweden and in the Netherlands and in the US and what he can find in Hong Kong and all. Trying to identify all these little changes.
Oh, someone just wrote, that's great. Laura Macaluso wrote, what do Chinese collectors think of this China trade material? Do they feature this material in their museums?
I
yeah,
can jump in there if you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Ed. That'd be great.
Yeah, so there's not in the porcelain, it's a little bit different, but certainly in the paintings, there's not a lot of demand from China yet. There is a demand for people in Hong Kong, okay, often those of, I'll call it Western descent. In Hong Kong, there's the Hong Kong Museum of Art, which I referred to earlier, has a great collection. The Hong Kong Maritime Museum has an excellent collection. There are now some in Canton or Guangzhou, a number of paintings in 2 different museums there, the Guangdong Provincial Museum and basically the City Museum of Guangzhou. But throughout the rest of China, I don't believe there's all that much. Because these were
That's
really, the paintings and all were done for the export market, and you find much of them in the West.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I do really hope that this show, some iteration of this show, can go to China, and whether it's Shanghai or Beijing. Um, and I think that this story is such an interesting one. When the show, there was a version of this show that was at the Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C., and there was a reception of the Committee of 100, who are prominent Chinese Americans. And at the time, the head of that was Gary Locke, who was the former ambassador to China and politician. And he invited the Chinese ambassador and some dignitaries from the embassy. And they really, I got to say, they really loved the show. And then they brought a whole contingent from the embassy to see the show and to really take it in. And I was kind of struck by how little some of them ultimately knew about this time in history. And there's a tendency to just paint it as all bad, you know, and everything is bad, when in fact, you know, there's a lot of complexity to all history. And I think that there's a lot to learn. And especially just given how important we are as trading partners, adversaries, you know, whatever word you want to use. You know, this relationship with China is, you know, what is it? It's about 250 years in, and it's, or 240. And it's important to know where it started and how it evolved. So I think it'd be a really neat thing to have in China.
It'd be interesting to think about, you know, how they might present, you know, some of this artwork and differences in terms of things that they might add or omit, certainly, um, you know, to I don't know, you know, to kind of what that story would look like. It's
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, and I think it's, you know, the key is to, and like we did in this show, to really talk about the Opium War and the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties and, you know, the unfairness, but also talk about how the trade, you know, came about and how different even it was with Americans versus the British. So there's just a lot of interesting complexity. And I think what's fascinating about this Lyman Allyn exhibit is how important Connecticut was and how wonderfully Tanya and others really played up that Connecticut story. And even the boys who came over, the 120 boys, and, you know, that wrapped up partially due to the Chinese government getting nervous about Western influence. But it was in, I think, 1881 that that all kind of shut down. These school in Hartford and these other boys at, you know, schools kind of up the Connecticut River. But then what also changed is Americans were getting very negative about the Chinese, and 1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, you know, those two kind of forces were colliding, and things were definitely souring by that point.
Yeah, I want to bring in a little bit of the relationship going back to Tanya's previous comments about China. China today, it's a very interesting thing of that era. I mean, they build up a lot of things like the Opium Wars and things like that for their own political sort of internal benefit. They tend to miss out that a lot of institutions, and particularly the early hospital system, okay, for example, I believe Peter Parker, who set up the ophthalmologist hospital in Canton, Guangzhou, was trained at Yale. Okay. Eliza Coleman Bridgman was the first American missionary, one of the first American missionaries into China. He and two other people basically translated the Bible into Chinese.
Mhm.
But a lot of educational institutions were set up by China. In fact, the absolutely largest funding by the Rockefeller Foundation was setting up the medical school in China in the 19 essentially teens and 20s. Peking Union Medical College still essentially exists, okay, with a slightly different name there. Similarly, in Shanghai, the hospital that's the major hospital in Shanghai is again founded originally by Americans.
It's fascinating. No, Ed, I think you're right. There's a lot of great history to be explored. Any other I know we're kind of running into the time limit, but any other questions out there?
I think we're hoping to schedule an in-person gallery talk, right near the conclusion of the exhibition, probably Saturday, September 13th, in the afternoon at probably 2 o'clock. Although I think it's not on our calendar, or I haven't seen it yet. But so if there are folks who are interested and want to chat a little bit more, some of us will be there to sort of talk about some of the objects in person, and it would be great to have some folks join us for that opportunity. So thank you, and thank you all for listening and sharing and being part of this conversation. We really appreciate it. And huge thanks to Richard and to Ed for your knowledge and your expertise in sharing some of this great information about other things in your collection and sort of things that fit and connect and relate to the exhibition, and then sort of that broader context as well has been great. So thank you.
Tanya,
All
thank you.
right. Yeah, no, thank you. This was really fun.